For a few seconds, and only a few seconds, the blast doors protecting one of Iran's underground missile silos were open. And according to defense analysts piecing this together, U.S. forces didn't wait for those doors to close before acting. So let's ask the question nobody's actually answering clearly yet. How do you hit something that's supposed to be sealed under solid rock, protected by blast doors built specifically to make that impossible? Because that's really the story hiding underneath this strike. It's not about brute force overcoming a hardened target. It's about recognizing that even the most hardened target on Earth has a moment of vulnerability built directly into its own design, whether its engineers intended that or not. Here's what's being reported, cross-referenced across multiple defense monitoring accounts. Underground missile silos, like the ones scattered throughout Iran's dispersed launch network, aren't sealed shut permanently. They can't be. Missiles inside need to be raised, aligned, and launched through an opening in the surface, which means every silo has a brief, unavoidable window where its otherwise impenetrable blast doors are physically open. That's a genuinely fascinating design constraint once you actually think it through. A silo built purely for storage could theoretically stay sealed indefinitely, protected by nothing but rock, concrete, and time. But a silo built to actually function as a weapon has to periodically break that seal, exposing whatever's inside to the outside world, however briefly, simply because a missile that can never be launched isn't actually a weapon at all. It's just very expensive, very well-protected storage. That window is normally measured in seconds, not minutes, just long enough for a launch sequence to complete, then sealed shut again almost immediately. For decades, that brief exposure window has been treated as an acceptable, unavoidable risk, because striking a target with that kind of precision, in that narrow A time frame, was considered operationally close to impossible. It's worth explaining exactly why that assumption held for as long as it did, because it wasn't simply outdated thinking or wishful optimism on the part of military planners. Achieving a strike this precisely timed requires an entirely different category of capability than traditional strike planning, which typically works against static, unmoving targets that don't require split-second timing to hit effectively. A missile silo's exposure window is a moving target in the truest sense, not because it physically relocates, but because the vulnerability itself only exists for an incredibly narrow slice of time. Before we get into how that assumption apparently just got proven wrong, and there's a detail about the timing involved that should genuinely surprise you, hit subscribe and stay with me, because this changes the entire calculus around what protected underground infrastructure actually means going forward. Here's what reportedly happened. Rather than attempting to penetrate the silo's hardened structure directly, forces reportedly used a combination of real-time surveillance and extremely fast reaction precision munitions, specifically positioned to strike the moment a silo's blast doors opened during what analysts believe was a routine launch readiness drill rather than an actual launch attempt. That distinction between a launch readiness drill and an actual launch attempt is worth pausing on because it reveals something important about how this specific opportunity likely came about. Militaries routinely conduct readiness drills, testing their ability to execute a launch sequence quickly and reliably without actually firing a missile. Those drills require opening the same blast doors, running through the same sequence, exposing the same vulnerability window, precisely because the entire point of the drill is verifying the system actually works under realistic conditions. That means this specific exposure window may not have been a rare one-time event at all. It may have been a predictable, recurring vulnerability tied to routine operational testing that happens on some regular cadence, simply because any functional missile system requires periodic verification that its launch sequence still works correctly. If that's accurate, it suggests the vulnerability exploited here wasn't a lucky, unrepeatable coincidence. It was a structural feature of how the system has to operate in order to remain a credible functional weapon at all. Think about what that actually requires operationally. It's not enough to simply know where a silo is located. You need real-time, continuous monitoring precise enough to detect the exact moment its doors begin opening, combined with a strike capability fast enough to actually hit that narrow window before the doors close again. That's an entirely different category of military capability than simply having a bigger bomb or a more powerful warhead. It's worth walking through exactly what that continuous monitoring requirement actually involves, because it's considerably more demanding than a single satellite pass identifying a static target. Achieving genuinely real-time detection of a blast door opening requires either persistent overhead surveillance capable of monitoring a specific location continuously, or some form of automated detection system capable of flagging the exact moment activity begins, fast enough that a strike can actually be executed before the window closes again. That kind of persistent automated monitoring represents a significant technological and operational investment, one that only makes sense if a specific target has been identified as valuable enough to justify dedicating that level of sustained attention to it. Which means this strike likely wasn't the product of a single lucky observation. It was almost certainly the culmination of sustained, deliberate surveillance focused specifically on this facility, over a period long enough to establish reliable patterns around when its exposure windows were likely to occur. Here's the detail that should genuinely catch your attention. According to several analysts studying this specific strike, the entire exposure window involved is believed to have lasted under 30 seconds, meaning the strike wasn't just precisely targeted, it was precisely timed to a level that most people wouldn't associate with conventional military strikes at all. 30 seconds is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's genuinely difficult to appreciate just how narrow that window actually is in operational terms. It's roughly the time it takes to read this sentence aloud a few times over. Coordinating detection, decision-making, and munition delivery within a window that tight requires either an extraordinarily fast, largely automated response chain, or an extremely precisely predicted opening time that allowed forces to have munitions already positioned and ready before the window even opened. That second possibility is worth exploring in more depth, because it may actually be the more likely explanation. If sustained surveillance had established a reliable pattern for when this facility's readiness drills typically occurred, forces wouldn't necessarily need to react within 30 seconds of detecting an opening. They could instead position munitions in advance, timed to arrive precisely when the predicted opening was expected to occur, converting what looks like an impossibly fast reaction into something closer to a carefully predicted prepositioned strike. That distinction matters enormously for understanding just how repeatable this kind of strike might be against other similar facilities. A strike that requires genuinely real-time split-second reaction to an unpredictable event is difficult to replicate reliably. A strike based on predicting a recurring patterned vulnerability, then positioning resources in advance to exploit that pattern, is a fundamentally more scalable and repeatable approach, one that could potentially be applied against every similar facility that follows a comparable operational testing schedule. That combination of positional precision and split-second timing is exactly why this particular strike is being described by some analysts as more significant than any single bunker buster or penetration weapon used earlier in this conflict. It doesn't rely on brute force overcoming hardened defenses. It relies on recognizing that even the most hardened defense has to open itself up eventually and being ready the exact moment that happens. There's a broader pattern worth naming here, because this isn't the first time in military history that the most secure-seeming defense turned out to have an unavoidable moment of exposure built into its own design. Every vault has to open to be used. Every fortress has a gate. Every hardened silo has to expose itself, however briefly, in order to actually function as a weapon rather than just a storage container. And that unavoidable exposure is exactly where a sufficiently patient, sufficiently precise adversary can find an opening no amount of surrounding rock or reinforced concrete can protect against. It's worth extending that principle a bit further, because it applies to an enormous range of hardened military systems well beyond missile silos specifically. Submarine pens have to open to let submarines in and out. Aircraft hangars have to open to allow planes to launch. Command bunkers have to allow personnel and communications to move in and out to remain operationally useful. Every one of these systems faces the exact same fundamental trade-off. The more secure and sealed they remain, the less functionally useful they are, and the more functionally useful they need to be, the more they're forced to periodically expose the vulnerability that comes with actually being used. That trade-off isn't something engineers can simply design their way out of, no matter how much time or resources get invested in hardening a facility. It's an inherent tension built into the very concept of protected infrastructure that still needs to function as a weapon or operational asset, rather than simply existing as a sealed, permanently inactive structure. Understanding that tension is genuinely one of the more important insights this specific strike offers, extending well beyond this single missile silo or even this specific conflict. It's worth considering, too, what this specific vulnerability means for how Iran, or any country facing a similar threat, might attempt to adapt going forward. Some potential countermeasures involve randomizing the timing of readiness drills, making them considerably less predictable and therefore harder for an adversary to anticipate and preposition against. Other potential countermeasures involve reducing the actual duration of the exposure window itself through faster door mechanisms or revised operational procedures designed to minimize the time any given silo spends physically open and vulnerable. Both of those adaptations come with real operational costs and trade-offs. Randomizing drill timing makes an adversary's job harder, but it also complicates a military's own internal training and readiness verification processes, potentially at the cost of overall system reliability. Reducing exposure window duration requires engineering changes that may not be quick or cheap to implement across an entire dispersed network of similar facilities, particularly under the resource constraints a country fighting an active multi-front conflict is likely operating under. There's also a psychological dimension worth exploring here, separate from the purely technical and tactical considerations. A military that learns one of its most hardened, most carefully protected systems was successfully struck during exactly the kind of narrow exposure window it had always assumed was too brief to realistically exploit, has to grapple with a genuinely uncomfortable recalibration. If this vulnerability was real and exploitable here, the same underlying principle likely applies to every other similarly designed facility throughout the broader network, regardless of how confident planners previously felt about the adequacy of that brief window's protection. That recalibration process, uncomfortable as it may be, is exactly the kind of adaptation that determines how quickly a military can respond to newly demonstrated vulnerabilities. Militaries that recognize and adapt quickly to this kind of exposed weakness tend to fare considerably better in prolonged conflicts than those that treat each individual incident as an isolated event, rather than a symptom of a broader, systemic vulnerability worth addressing comprehensively. Let's talk about how a strike this precisely timed actually gets planned from a purely technical standpoint, because understanding the underlying systems involved makes the achievement considerably more impressive than a simple headline about hitting an underground base can capture. Achieving reliable, real-time detection of a specific, narrow event, like a blast door opening, requires sensor systems capable of monitoring the target continuously, processing that data fast enough to recognize the event as it happens, and relaying that information to whatever strike system is positioned to respond, all within a window measured in seconds rather than minutes. That entire chain of detection, processing, and response represents one of the more technically demanding capabilities in modern precision warfare, considerably more complex than simply identifying a static target's coordinates and directing a weapon toward them. Every link in that chain has to function essentially flawlessly, because a delay at any single point, whether in detection, data processing, or weapons response time, could easily cause the strike to arrive after the window had already closed, wasting the entire operation. It's worth exploring what kind of surveillance infrastructure would realistically be required to achieve this level of continuous, real-time monitoring against a specific, hardened facility. Persistent overhead surveillance, whether from satellites in favorable orbital positions or from drones capable of loitering over a target for extended periods, represents one plausible approach. Another possibility involves ground-based or signals intelligence capable of detecting the specific operational signatures associated with a launch readiness drill beginning, potentially providing advance warning before the physical blast doors even start to open. That advance warning possibility is worth considering seriously, because it would help explain how a strike with this precise a timing window could realistically be executed without relying purely on split-second reactive capability. If certain preparatory activities, like personnel movement, equipment activation, or specific communications patterns, reliably precede an actual drill or launch sequence by several minutes, that would provide enough advance notice for munitions to be positioned and timed appropriately, without requiring the kind of instantaneous reaction that would otherwise seem almost impossible to achieve reliably. There's a comparison worth drawing here to how modern missile defense systems approach a broadly similar timing challenge, because the underlying technical problem shares some real similarities. Missile defense systems have to detect a launch, calculate an intercept trajectory, and position a countermeasure, all within an extremely narrow window measured in minutes or even seconds, depending on the specific threat involved. The engineering and operational lessons learned from decades of missile defense development likely inform, at least indirectly, how offensive strike capabilities targeting narrow exposure windows like this one have been developed and refined. It's also worth talking about the broader strategic decision-making that goes into choosing to expend this level of surveillance and strike coordination effort on a single target. Achieving a strike this precisely coordinated isn't cheap in either resources or sustained intelligence attention. Military planners have to weigh whether a specific facility's strategic value justifies dedicating this level of sustained, resource-intensive monitoring and coordination, rather than pursuing a comparatively simpler, if less precisely targeted, alternative approach. That prioritization decision suggests this specific facility was assessed as holding genuinely significant strategic value, likely tied to its role within Iran's broader dispersed missile network, its proximity to other high-value targets, or its assessed operational readiness relative to similar facilities elsewhere. Understanding exactly why this particular silo was selected for this level of sustained attention offers a useful window into how defense planners are prioritizing targets throughout this broader conflict, even when the public-facing coverage rarely explains that underlying prioritization logic in any detail. There's a broader lesson here worth extending into how future conflicts in this region or elsewhere are likely to be shaped by this kind of demonstrated capability. If timing-based strikes against brief exposure windows prove consistently achievable, that fundamentally changes the calculus for any military relying on hardened, periodically exposed infrastructure as a core part of its deterrent strategy. The assumption that brief exposure windows represented an acceptable, effectively unavoidable risk may no longer hold with the same confidence it once did, forcing a broader reassessment of how these systems get designed, operated, and protected going forward. It's worth considering, too, how this kind of demonstrated capability might influence broader deterrence calculations beyond this specific conflict. Militaries around the world that rely on similar hardened, periodically exposed systems, whether missile silos, submarine pens, or other comparable infrastructure, are almost certainly studying reports of this strike closely, extracting whatever lessons apply to their own system's vulnerability to a similarly patient, similarly precise approach. That broader ripple effect is genuinely one of the more significant, if least discussed, consequences of a strike like this one. The immediate tactical impact matters to this specific conflict. The demonstrated capability itself, once it becomes broadly understood, potentially reshapes strategic thinking about hardened infrastructure design for military planners far beyond the borders of this particular war, in exactly the same way earlier breakthroughs in precision. Guided weaponry reshaped strategic thinking decades before this specific conflict ever began. So here's where all of this actually connects back to the broader arc of this specific conflict, and what it might mean for the underground missile network this strike targeted. If this exposure window vulnerability applies broadly across Iran's dispersed missile silo network, rather than being unique to this single facility, that suggests a potentially systemic vulnerability affecting a much wider range of targets than just the one struck this week. Every silo in that network faces the same fundamental design trade-off between security and functionality, and every silo, by necessity, has to periodically expose itself in order to remain a credible, functional part of that broader deterrent system. So here's where I land on this. The headlines will focus on the drama of hitting something underground and protected, because that fits the story everyone already expects. But the real insight here is quieter and considerably more unsettling for anyone relying on hardened infrastructure. No defense can stay sealed forever, and the moment it opens, even for seconds, is the moment everything it was built to protect becomes vulnerable. There's a final point worth leaving you with, because it's the detail that will likely matter most in the weeks ahead. If this strike genuinely exploited a systemic or repeatable vulnerability rather than a one-time fluke, watch closely for whether similar strikes against other silos in this same network start appearing in the coming weeks. A single successful strike against a narrow exposure window could be an isolated tactical achievement. A pattern of similar strikes against multiple facilities would confirm something considerably more significant, that an entire category of hardened infrastructure just had its core defensive assumption quietly, systematically dismantled. That's genuinely the principle worth carrying forward from this entire story, extending well beyond this specific missile silo or even this specific conflict. Every hardened system, no matter how sophisticated, faces the same fundamental trade-off between security and functionality, and the moment that trade-off tips toward functionality, even briefly, is the moment a sufficiently patient, sufficiently precise adversary can turn that necessary exposure into a decisive advantage. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If a 30-second window was all it took, how many other impenetrable systems in this conflict have an exposure window nobody's accounted for yet? Drop your take in the comments. I want to know what you think gets exposed next. And if breakdowns like this, the split-second details that actually decide how wars get fought, are what you come here for, hit subscribe, because there's a lot more of this story still unfolding.